This is a story about a man who came home to bury ghosts, only to find they were still breathing. It's about a stolen homeland, a forgotten massacre, and a conspiracy so deep it was etched into the very bones of the earth. But most of all, it's a story about a fire lit to keep warm, that ended up burning down a century of lies. The trail to Fort Alden was a mean, twisted thing, like a scar carved into the red sandstone of eastern Arizona. The wind whispered through the canyons, carrying the scent of dust and creosote in a history of violence. For Silas Towhee, every gust of that wind felt like a voice from the grave. He was Apache, and this land was in his blood, but he hadn't set foot here in 10 years. Not since he wore the blue coat of a cavalry scout, taking orders from men who called him a friend to his face and a savage behind his back. They used him. They called him loyal, and when the dirty work was done, they discarded him. Now he was back. Not as a scout, not as a soldier, but as a man running from a past that was faster than any horse. His stallion, Coda, a muscular blue roan, snorted and stamped a hoof, sensing the change in the air. Silas pulled on the reins, bringing him to a stop on a high knoll. Below them, nestled in a grove of skeletal juniper trees, were the ruins of Fort Alden. 3 stone buildings, their roofs caved in, their walls crumbling. Only the central watchtower stood defiant, a single stone finger pointing accusingly at the sky. This was the place. Long before the soldiers came with their flags and their fences, his grandfather had brought their people here for the winter hunt. Silas could almost hear the echo of the drums, the laughter around the fires, the old stories told under a blanket of stars. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the familiar red dust. He left Coda to graze and walked the final stretch. Each step an act of defiance, each breath a reclamation. He reached the main blockhouse, a squat, powerful building of heavy dark stone. He put a hand on the wall, feeling the cold seep into his palm. And that's when he knew something was wrong. A smell, faint but unmistakable. Smoke. A thin, ghostly wisp curled from the chimney stack. It wasn't the smell of an old, dead fire. It was fresh. Someone was in there. Silas moved like a phantom, his moccasins making no sound on the broken ground. He unslung the bow from his back. An arrow knocked before he even thought about it. He wasn't looking for a fight, but out here, in the heart of nowhere, a trespasser was often a dead man. He pressed his ear to the cold stone wall and listened. He heard the wind rattling a loose shutter. He heard the groan of old wood. And then he heard a sound that made the hairs on his neck stand up. A cough. A woman's cough. He moved to the door, a heavy slab of oak hanging from a single rusted hinge. He pushed it open, and it screamed in protest. The interior was a cathedral of decay. Shafts of sunlight pierced the collapsed roof, illuminating clouds of dancing dust and ash. And there, by the massive stone hearth, was a woman. She knelt beside a small, struggling fire, her back to him. She wore men's clothes, worn trousers, a dusty coat, and boots that were 2 sizes too big. Her hair, the color of copper and gold, was tied up in a messy knot. She struck a piece of steel against flint, coaxing a spark into the tinder. She was so focused, she didn't see him. She didn't hear him. She didn't feel the hunter's eyes on her back. He watched her for a long moment, a ghost in his own home, watching a stranger light a fire on his family's hearth. He could have left. He could have turned around and ridden away, leaving her to her solitude. But this was his land, and he needed to know who dared to wake its spirits. He took a single step forward, the crunch of his boot on a fallen roof shingle echoing like a gunshot in the silence. She froze, her hand hovering over the tiny flame. Then slowly, she turned her head. Her eyes met his, and in that instant, the world seemed to stop. She wasn't afraid. He expected fear, a scream perhaps. Instead, he saw defiance. A spark in her blue eyes that matched the one she'd just struck from the flint. Silas spoke, his voice low and rough from disuse. "You're trespassing." She rose to her feet in a single fluid motion, brushing the soot from her hands. Her voice was clear, sharp, with an accent he couldn't quite place. It wasn't from around here. "So are you," she shot back. A flicker of surprise, maybe even admiration, passed through him. This woman had steel in her spine. He tilted his head. I own this place. Bought the deed 2 weeks ago. Fort Alden and all 20 acres of its ghosts. Her gaze didn't waver. She looked him up and down, taking in his Apache features. The worn leather of his clothes, the lethal grace in his stance. Then I suppose that makes us neighbors, she said, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. My name is Ivy Lockhart. Silas gave a curt nod. Silas Tohi. He saw a flicker of recognition in her eyes at his surname, a brief tightening around her mouth, but she said nothing. She bent down, picked up a worn leather satchel, and slung it over her shoulder. I wasn't planning on a long visit. Just needed a roof over my head for the night. He couldn't help himself. A rare, dry smile touched his own lips. You make a habit of camping out in abandoned army forts? Her expression hardened, the brief flicker of warmth gone as quickly as it came. Only the ones my father died in, she said, her voice flat and cold as a tombstone. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the weight of her words. Lockhart. The name echoed in the chambers of his memory, kicking up dust and shadows he'd long tried to forget. Captain Elias Lockhart, the commanding officer of this very fort, the man who had taken a patrol out into the canyons one sunny morning in '84 and never came back. The official report was a mess of contradictions. Some said his men mutinied. Others whispered desertion. The army, eager to close the book, chose the story that suited them best. A disgraced captain and his treacherous men, swallowed by the wilderness. But Silas knew the whispers of his own people told a different story, a darker story. He looked at the woman standing before him, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a fire that had been banked for years. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was destiny, or something that looked a lot like it, knocking on his door. You're his daughter, he stated, not a question. He disappeared. His body was never found. They called him a coward, Ivy said, her voice trembling with a rage she'd clearly held on to for a decade. A traitor. They stripped him of his rank, his honor. They lied. Silas stepped closer, the space between them shrinking, the dying fire at their feet the only thing separating them. What are you really doing here, Miss Lockhart? She hesitated, her gaze dropping to the satchel at her side. For a moment, he thought she would refuse, that she would retreat back into the fortress of her secrets. But then, with a deep breath, she unlatched the bag. She pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was a soldier's journal, its cover scorched at one corner, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. My father kept a record, she said, her voice barely a whisper. He wrote down everything that happened at this fort, but the last few entries, they're different. She opened the journal, and Silas saw pages filled with tight, frantic script. It was a mix of military shorthand, a strange cipher of numbers and symbols, and something else, something that made his blood run cold. Words spelled out phonetically, Apache words. He was learning the language, Ivy explained. He respected your people. He wrote in one of his letters that this fort was built on a foundation of blood and lies, and that one day the earth itself would cry out for justice. Silas stared at the book, his mind racing. The fire in the hearth crackled, a single ember flaring to life. Ivy's voice grew stronger, fueled by a decade of unanswered questions. I came here to finish what he started, to find out what really happened to him, to uncover whatever secret this place buried. Silas looked away from the journal, his eyes scanning the crumbling stone walls of the blockhouse. He knew this room. He'd stood guard in it, a boy of 17 in a scout's uniform, watching as his own people were dragged through that very door, their faces bruised and bloodied, their spirits broken. He remembered the whispers of a massacre, of a wagon train full of families that had simply vanished from the face of the earth. He remembered the cold, dead eyes of the soldiers who rode back into the fort, their saddles empty, their mouths shut tight. And he remembered his own father, another Apache scout, warning him to never ask questions, to never dig too deep. His father had vanished a month later. Silas turned back to Ivy, a decision forming in his gut. This was her fight, yes, but it was his too. It was his father's. It was his people's. You should stay, he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Ivy looked at him, startled. I just told you I'm looking for something that powerful men want to keep buried. Something dangerous. Silas shrugged, a simple gesture that carried the weight of a lifetime of survival. He walked to the hearth, picked up a dry branch from her kindling pile, and tossed it into the embers. A small flame caught, flickered, and then grew steady, pushing back the shadows. He looked at her, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. "You already lit the fire," he said. And in the silence that followed, they both knew he wasn't just talking about the one in the hearth. The watchfire had been lit again, and the ghosts of Fort Alden were beginning to wake up. The desert night dropped like a velvet curtain, cold and studded with a million diamond-sharp stars. They didn't talk much. They shared a meal of dried jerky and hardtack, a silent communion in the heart of the ruins. Silas took watch by the door, his rifle resting across his lap, while Ivy curled up in her coat near the warmth of the fire, her father's journal clutched to her chest like a prayer book. Sleep didn't come easily for Silas. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every shadow seemed to hold a figure. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but Ivy's presence had changed the equation. Her quest had become his. Her danger was now his danger. Dawn broke, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose. Ivy was already awake, her eyes fixed on the journal, which was spread open on her lap. "I think I found something," she said, her voice hushed with excitement. Silas moved to her side, crouching by the fire. She pointed to a page near the back, the writing small and hurried. "It's one of the coded entries," she said. "But look at this part." He wrote it in plain English, almost like a note to himself. She read the words aloud, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of dread. March 3rd, 1884. Orders came at dusk. Unofficial. Spoken. Not written. 2 wagons. No names. No survivors. Tohi warned me. He said the canyon runs red if you dig too deep. Ivy looked up at him, her blue eyes wide with a question she was almost afraid to ask. "Tohi, do you think—" Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He stared at the name on the page, the ink faded but undeniable. "Tohi was my father's name," he said softly, the confession feeling like a betrayal and a revelation all at once. "I never told anyone his full name. He served as a guide for the army, just like I did. They trusted him until he started asking the wrong questions." Ivy's breath hitched. "So he was warning my father. He knew what they were planning." "He was warning him to stay away," Silas corrected, his voice grim. He looked around at the stone walls, at the history soaked into them. "And my father vanished a few weeks after this entry was written. They found his camp, burned to the ground. No body. They said he ran." He stood up and paced the room, a caged animal. The pieces were slotting into place, forming a picture more horrific than he had ever imagined. His father and her father, 2 good men on opposite sides of a conflict, bound together by a secret that had cost them both everything. Ivy turned another page, her fingers tracing the strange symbols and phonetic Apache words. Then she stopped. Tucked into a leather sleeve on the back cover of the journal was a small, crudely drawn map. It showed a piece of land northeast of the fort, a place marked only by a bold, dark X, and below the X, 2 words were scrawled in her father's hand. La Sangre Rota. "The broken blood," Ivy translated, her voice barely a whisper. Silas nodded grimly. "I know the place. It's not on any official maps. The elders called it the Canyon of Whispers, a place of bad spirits. They said the ground there is cursed." He looked at the map, then at Ivy, her face a pale oval in the firelight. "It's where they took the wagons." She folded the map with decisive hands and tucked it into her coat. "Then that's where we go." "No," Silas said, his voice sharp. "Not yet. We're not alone." Ivy frowned. "What are you talking about?" Instead of answering, he motioned for her to follow him outside. The sun was higher now, burning off the last of the morning mist. He led her around the perimeter of the fort, his eyes scanning the ground. He stopped, pointing to a patch of sand near a crumbling section of the wall. "Tracks," he said. 3 riders. They circled the fort last night. Watched us." Ivy's eyes widened. She couldn't see anything but disturbed sand. "How can you tell?" He pointed to a single broken blade of prairie grass. "It's bent the wrong way. A horse stepped on it, moving west. But the hoof prints are shallow, the pattern is wide. They were riding light, moving slow. Scouts. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Were they following me? Maybe, Silas said. Or maybe they're guarding this place, waiting for someone to come digging. He knelt down, his fingers brushing the sand, and picked up a small object, glinting in the morning sun. It was a brass cartridge casing. He turned it over in his palm. 44-40 Winchester, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Government issue. He looked up at her, his dark eyes like chips of obsidian. You haven't seen any soldiers, you said. Well, you've seen them now. They just don't wear the uniform anymore. They returned to the blockhouse, the silence between them, charged with a new and immediate sense of danger. The ghosts of the past were one thing. The men with guns watching them from the ridges were another. The threat was no longer a half-remembered story. It was real. It was present. And it was closing in. Silas began to rebuild the fire in the hearth, not for warmth this time, but with a specific purpose. He added green juniper branches to the dry wood, creating a thick, heavy smoke. What are you doing? Ivy asked, watching him with a mixture of confusion and alarm. An old tradition, he explained, his movements deliberate. A watchfire. When this land belonged to my people, a smoke signal could mean many things. A call for a council, a warning of danger, a request for aid. Ivy looked toward the door, then back at the pillar of smoke now rising steadily from the chimney. But who will see it? What if the wrong people see it? Silas added a bundle of sage to the flames, its sharp, clean scent filling the air. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. The wrong people, he said grimly, already know we're here. The smoke climbed into the vast blue sky, a question mark written in ash, a silent challenge sent out into the wilderness. And now all they could do was wait to see who, or what, answered. The hours crawled by. The sun arced across the sky, a merciless eye beating down on the ruins. Ivy sat on the stone threshold of the blockhouse, the open journal in her lap, but she wasn't reading. She was sketching on a blank page, her charcoal stick moving with a practiced grace. She was drawing a face from memory, a man with kind eyes, a strong jaw, and a captain's mustache. Her father. Silas watched her from a distance. He saw the slight tremble in her hand, the way her lips tightened when she worked on the details around his eyes. He walked over and sat beside her, not too close, leaving a respectful distance between them. He looks like a good man, Silas said quietly. Ivy didn't look up from her drawing. He was. He taught me how to read, how to shoot a rifle, and how to tell a truth from a lie. When the army sent that telegram calling him a deserter, I knew. I knew they were lying. Silas nodded, understanding the sentiment perfectly. My father used to say that the land remembers everything. Men forget, men lie. But the wind, the rocks, the fire, they hold the truth. Ivy finally looked up, her gaze meeting his. Then I guess we're in the right place to ask it some questions. As she spoke, Silas's eyes narrowed. He was looking past her, out towards the eastern ridges. His body went still, every muscle tensed. What is it? Ivy whispered, following his gaze. On a distant bluff, silhouetted against the afternoon sun, was a lone rider. He wasn't moving. He was just sitting on his horse, a black statue watching them. The figure was too far away to make out any details, but his stillness was more menacing than any threat. He was a sentinel, a predator waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. They watched him for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching taut between them. Then, as slowly as he appeared, the rider turned his horse and vanished behind the ridge. A cold dread washed over Ivy. Was that one of the scouts? She asked, her voice tight. Silas shook his head, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle. No. Scouts move in groups. They use cover. That was different. Different how? That, Silas said, his eyes still locked on the empty ridge, was a message. The message was clear. We see you. We know what you're looking for, and we're not going to let you find it. The watchfire smoke continued to curl into the sky, no longer just a call for help, but a declaration of war. And Silas Towhee knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that blood was coming back to Fort Alden. They didn't wait for darkness. The rider on the ridge had changed the timeline. Waiting was no longer an option. It was a death sentence. "We go now," Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "To the canyon." They saddled Coda, but Ivy's horse was gone. The scouts had taken it during the night, a quiet act of sabotage. It was another message. "You are stranded." "They're trying to trap us here," Ivy said, her frustration boiling over. "They want us pinned down." Silas scanned the ruins and his eyes lit up. Tucked away behind the collapsed stables was another horse, a scrawny-looking Mustang, left tethered with a worn saddle and an empty canteen. It was one of the scouts' mounts. "They left in a hurry," Silas observed, checking the cinch. "Or they saw our smoke and decided they'd rather watch from a distance." He helped Ivy onto the borrowed horse, and they rode east, away from the fort, and towards the place marked La Sangre Rota. The landscape grew harsher, the flat plains giving way to jagged ravines and cliffs of blood-red rock. The canyon wasn't on any map because it wasn't a place people went to. It was a place they disappeared from. They reached the edge as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. The canyon was a monstrous wound in the earth, a deep, twisting chasm that seemed to swallow the light. The walls glowed a dark, malevolent red, as if the very rock was saturated with blood. "We go on foot from here," Silas said, dismounting. He tied the horses to a gnarled mesquite tree and grabbed a coil of rope and a lantern. The path down was a treacherous ribbon of rock, barely wide enough for one person. They hugged the cliff face, the stone rough against their shoulders, the drop a dizzying void beside them. Halfway down, the path widened into a long, flat ledge, and there Silas stopped. "This is it," he said, his voice heavy. "This is where it happened." The ledge was a graveyard of ambition and violence. Splintered wagon wheels, rotting wooden crates, and the rusted metal of axles lay scattered across the stone, half buried by decades of sand and rockfall. Vultures scattered at their approach, their heavy wings beating the air. Ivy knelt beside a crate, her fingers brushing away the dust. Faded stencil letters spelled out, U.S. Cavalry, Fort Alden Supply. "This was a convoy," she whispered, her mind struggling to process the scene. Silas nodded grimly. "The army said your father and his men stole these supplies and deserted." He walked to the center of the ledge, where the tip of a rusted bayonet protruded from the ground. "They didn't run," he said, his voice thick with a cold, hard fury. "They were executed." Around the bayonet, the truth lay exposed. Bones, dozens of them, bleached white by the sun, tangled with the tattered remains of blue cavalry uniforms. Skulls with neat, round holes in them, rib cages shattered by bullets. Ivy covered her mouth with her hand, a choked sob escaping her lips. This wasn't a battle. This was a firing squad. Silas crouched, his face a mask of stone. He gently picked up a small metal insignia from the dust, a captain's bars. He held them out to Ivy, her father's. Tears streamed down her face, silent and hot. They had murdered him. They had murdered them all, and then they had branded them cowards to cover their crime. "They blame my people," Silas said, his voice a low growl. "They always did. They said Apache raiders ambushed the convoy." He stood up, his gaze sweeping across the killing ground. "My father vanished the same month this happened. His camp was just 5 miles from here. When I finally got back, there was nothing left but ash and boot prints. Soldiers' boot prints." The wind howled through the canyon, a mournful cry for the dead. It all made a terrible kind of sense. Her father had discovered something, a secret so dark the army was willing to slaughter its own men to protect it. And Silas's father, the Apache scout who knew too much, had been silenced as well. "There's more," Ivy said, her voice shaking but resolute. She pulled the journal from her coat, flipping to the last, frantic entry. "He wrote about hiding something, proof, a ledger with names and orders. He said he hid it in a stone crevice marked with white lichen, above the fall of bones." Silas's eyes immediately began scanning the canyon wall above the ledge. And there it was, a dark cleft in the rock, and around its edges a pale, ghostly patch of grayish-white lichen. It was 10 feet up the sheer rock face. "Give me a boost," Ivy said, her grief momentarily replaced by a fierce determination. Silas cupped his hands and she used his shoulders to climb, her worn boots finding purchase on the unforgiving rock. She reached the crevice, her fingers probing the darkness within. They brushed against something wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled it out. It was a thick, heavy book, a military ledger. She scrambled back down, her hands shaking as she unwrapped the package. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was her father's, neat and precise. She read the words aloud, her voice ringing with a mixture of horror and triumph. Operations log, Captain Elias Lockhart, Fort Alden. Confidential. She looked at Silas, her eyes blazing. This is it. This is the proof. Silas took the ledger, his hands surprisingly gentle as he turned the pages. It was all there. Dates, names, orders signed by a Colonel Marcus Thorne, the territorial commander. The orders were chillingly clear. Intercept and eliminate a peaceful Apache delegation traveling under a flag of truce. 2 wagons filled not with warriors, but with elders, women, and children. The official report was to be an ambush by unknown hostiles. Captain Lockhart and his men were then to be disposed of as deserters to tie up any loose ends. It was a state-sanctioned massacre, ordered and covered up by the highest levels of command. Thorne, Silas spat the name like poison. He went on to become a senator, one of the most powerful men in the territory. The scale of the conspiracy was staggering. These weren't just soldiers following orders. These were architects of genocide who had built their careers on a foundation of bones. We have to take this to the authorities, Ivy said, her voice filled with a righteous fire. Silas shook his head slowly, his eyes dark with a weary wisdom. You saw the watchers. You saw the cartridge casing. The authorities are the ones who sent them. He pointed up towards the rim of the canyon. Someone is still protecting this secret, and they're not going to let this ledger leave the canyon. Ivy clutched the book to her chest. Then what do? We bring it back to the fort, Silas said, a plan forming in his mind. There's a loose stone in the chimney in the blockhouse, a hiding place I made as a boy. No one knows it exists, not even the ghosts. They began the perilous climb back up the canyon wall, the ledger a heavy weight in Ivy's satchel. As they neared the top, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows, Silas suddenly froze. He grabbed Ivy's arm, pulling her back into the cover of an overhang. Stay still, he whispered. On the ridge above them, the same ridge where they had seen the lone rider, stood a man. Not a silhouette this time. He was close enough now to see clearly. He wore a long black duster, and a wide-brimmed hat was pulled low over his face. He wasn't looking at them. He was looking down into the canyon, at the ledge of bones. He stood there for a long moment, a grim reaper surveying his work. Then he turned his head, and his eyes, even from that distance, seemed to lock directly onto theirs. He knew. He knew they were there. He knew what they had found. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't shout a warning. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. Then he turned, mounted a horse that was hidden from their view, and rode away. Ivy's heart was hammering against her ribs. Who was that? Silas didn't take his eyes off the empty ridge. A name from his past rose from the depths of his memory, a name associated with cold-blooded efficiency and unquestioning loyalty to the army. A man who had been Colonel Thorne's right hand. That, Silas said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper, was Elias Crow, and he just declared war. They returned to Fort Alden under the cold, indifferent light of a full moon. The ruins looked even more like a tomb, the shadows deep and menacing. The air was thick with tension. Every rustle of a leaf, every distant coyote howl, sounded like an approaching enemy. Inside the blockhouse, the embers of their fire were a faint, pulsing red eye in the darkness. Silas went straight to the hearth. He worked a large, flat stone loose from the chimney base, revealing a dark, hollow space behind it. Ivy, her hands still trembling from the encounter with Crow, carefully placed the oilcloth-wrapped ledger inside. Silas fitted the stone back into place, the seal perfect. It looked as if it hadn't been touched in 50 years. Let them come, he murmured, wiping dust from his hands. They'll tear this place apart and find nothing. Ivy sank onto a wooden crate, the adrenaline of the day finally giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. Do you think they know for sure that we found it? Silas stoked the fire back to life, the flames casting dancing shadows on his grim face. They don't need to know. They just need to suspect. For men like Crow, suspicion is the same as a guilty verdict. The wind moaned outside, a lonely, mournful sound. And then another sound cut through it, a rhythmic, metallic jingle. Spurs on stone, getting closer. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his rifle in his hand. He moved to the doorway, a silent shadow against the stone. He motioned for Ivy to hide behind the hearth, where a low crawl space offered some concealment. But it was too late. Before he could reach the door, it creaked open. A man stepped into the firelight, his form silhouetted by the moon behind him. He was tall and lean, wearing the same long duster and black hat they had seen on the ridge. His face was a road map of hard miles and harder choices, a scar cutting a white line from his temple to his jaw. A Colt revolver rested easy on his hip, not as a tool, but as a natural extension of his body. It was Elias Crow. He didn't seem surprised to see them. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply stood there, his cold eyes taking in the scene. "Been a long time, Tohi," he said, his voice like gravel scraping against rock. Silas didn't lower his rifle, but he didn't raise it either. "Crow," he replied, his own voice flat and even. "I thought you'd be a ghost by now." From her hiding spot, Ivy's blood ran cold. The sheer lack of fear between the two men was more terrifying than any open aggression. This was a conversation that had been waiting to happen for a decade. Crow took a step into the room, his spurs jingling softly. "Heard you bought this pile of rocks. Never figured you for the sentimental type." He ran a gloved hand along the stone wall. "Used to be a fine post, before Captain Lockhart got a conscience." His eyes, like a hawk's, swiveled and landed directly on Ivy. He smiled, but it was a cold, predatory thing. "And you must be the daughter. Ivy, your father wrote about you in his letters. A pretty little thing with a stubborn streak." Ivy stood up, her fear replaced by a surge of white-hot anger. "How do you know who I am?" "Because I was the man he sent his letters to," Crow said, his smile widening. "He didn't trust the chain of command. He knew Colonel Thorne was dirty. He sent his suspicions to me, in Tucson, begged me to open an official inquiry." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "He thought I was his friend. He said if anything happened to him, I was the only one who knew the truth." Silas took a half step forward, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "And you let him die." "I didn't kill him," Crow said, turning his attention to Silas. "Not personally, but when a man is determined to stick his hand in a snake pit, you don't stop him. You just step back and let the snakes do their work." "Why?" Ivy's voice was a choked whisper. "Why would you protect them?" Crow let out a long, weary sigh, as if explaining something to a child. "Because this territory wasn't built on prayer and handshakes, little lady. It was built on blood and iron. Progress requires sacrifice. Thorne, the senator now, he understood that. He knew that for the railroad to come through, for the mines to open, for civilization to take root, certain obstacles had to be removed." He looked from Ivy to Silas. "You found the canyon. You found the bones. You know what those obstacles were." "They were families," Ivy spat. "Women and children." "They were the past," Crow corrected her calmly, "and we were building the future." He took another step forward, his eyes fixed on the chimney. "Now I believe you have something that belongs to me. A ledger. It's a relic of a bygone era, and it's time for it to be properly buried, along with the captain's memory." Silas moved to block his path. "You're not touching it." Crow stopped, studying Silas with a detached professional curiosity. "You always were a good scout, Tohi. Fast, quiet, loyal in your own way. But you're one man. I have a dozen riders, all of them getting paid a bonus to bring me back that book. And they don't care how many bodies they have to step over to get it." He held Silas's gaze for a long moment. Then, to their astonishment, he stepped back and turned toward the door. "I won't fight you tonight. Not here. You'd probably win. You know this ground too well." He paused at the threshold, turning his head slightly. "But my patience has its limits. You have 2 days. Bring the ledger to the old mission at 3 Creeks. I'll be waiting." If you don't show, he let the threat hang in the air. Well, my men get impatient, and they won't be as polite as I am. They won't knock. And then he was gone, the jingle of his spurs fading into the night, leaving behind a silence that was louder and more terrifying than any gunshot. Ivy sank onto the crate, her body trembling. Who is he? Really? Silas finally lowered his rifle, his shoulders slumping slightly. Elias Crow was Thorne's fixer, his shadow. When the army needed a message delivered, a witness silenced, or a problem to disappear, they sent Crow. He was the man who buried the bodies. He looked at the hearth, at the stone hiding the ledger. And he's been burying them for 20 years. 2 days, Ivy whispered. What can we do in 2 days? A desperate plan began to form in Silas's mind. It was a long shot, a gamble on a loyalty that had been tested by time and betrayal. He picked up a piece of charcoal from the edge of the hearth and knelt on the stone floor. He began to draw a crude map. There's a man, he said, his voice low and urgent. An old Paiute elder named Toma. He served as a scout with my father. They were like brothers. Toma never believed the army's lies. He spent the last 20 years collecting stories, testimonies, building his own record, an oral history of the army's crimes. Can we get to him? Ivy asked, a sliver of hope in her voice. He's 2 days' ride north, in the mountains. We'll never make it past Crow's men. Not without help, Silas agreed. He stood up and walked outside into the cold moonlight. Ivy followed him. He went to the center of the fort's old parade ground and began to build a new fire. Not a small, warm hearth fire, but a large, deliberate pyre. He used cedar for its thick, white smoke and pine for its bright, hot flame. And into the heart of it, he placed a handful of sage bundles, tightly wrapped in red cord, a symbol of great urgency, understood only by the old tribes. Ivy watched the flames lick higher, catching the scent of the burning sage. What are you doing now? The first fire brought us nothing but trouble. Silas looked at the smoke as it climbed into the night sky, a pillar of defiance against the darkness. Crow thinks he has us trapped. He thinks we're alone. But there's one thing he doesn't know, one thing he's forgotten. What's that? Ivy asked. Silas looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight, burning with a new fierce light of their own. This land remembers its own, he said. Far, far to the north, on a distant mountain peak, a tiny light flickered in answer. And then another. The old lines of communication, dormant for a generation, were waking up. Help was coming, but the question remained. Would it get there in time? Dawn on the second day broke cold and gray. The signal fire had burned down to a mound of glowing, pulsating embers. Silas hadn't slept. He'd spent the night watching, listening, a sentinel at the edge of his world. Ivy had dozed fitfully, the journal in her lap, her dreams filled with gunfire and whispering ghosts. They were out of time. Crow and his men would be coming soon. Do you really think they'll come? Ivy asked, joining him on the bluff overlooking the plains. Toma and the others? Silas stared at the horizon, his face etched with a tension that was almost unbearable. When the army broke the treaties, they didn't just break promises. They broke families. They scattered our people to the four winds. Toma was one of the few who stayed. He swore an oath over my father's burned-out camp. He swore he would wait for a sign, for someone to light the fire again. He turned to her, his expression grim. I've lit the fire. Now we see if the oath still holds. Not long after sunrise, they heard them. Not the heavy, disciplined tread of cavalry, but the light, swift hoofbeats of unshod ponies. 4 of them. Silas grabbed his rifle, but a sense of relief washed over him. He recognized that rhythm. They weren't enemies. 3 figures emerged from the morning mist. An old man, his face a beautiful mask of wrinkles, wrapped in a faded blue army blanket. He was flanked by a tall, stern-faced Navajo man with a bow slung across his back, and a young woman, no older than Ivy, with a long black braid and eyes that missed nothing. The old man raised a hand in greeting. Silas Towhee, he called out, his voice a gravelly rasp. They told me you were dead. A rare, genuine smile touched Silas's lips. Toma, You're a sight for sore eyes. I am old, not blind, Toma replied, dismounting with a groan. He walked straight to Ivy, his sharp, intelligent eyes studying her face. You have his eyes, the captain's. He was a good man, died with a clean heart, which is more than can be said for most who wore that uniform. Ivy Lockhart, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Thank you. They gathered inside the blockhouse, the air buzzing with a desperate energy. Ivy retrieved the ledger from its hiding place. Toma ran a gnarled finger over the cover, then opened it. He nodded slowly as he scanned the pages. I remember this. Lockhart used to trade me tobacco for Apache words. He was trying to understand. He knew a great evil was nesting here. He looked up at Silas, his eyes hard. This book, your story, the Canyon of Bones, it is enough. Enough for what? Ivy asked. Enough to burn the lie to the ground, Toma declared. He explained their plan. With this ledger, they could go to the tribal council in Prescott. They could prove that Senator Thorne, a man lauded as a hero and a pioneer, had built his entire career on the massacre of innocent people. They could take the story to the newspapers. They could force a federal investigation. For the first time, they wouldn't just be telling stories of ghosts. They would have the paper, the ink, the signatures. They would have the white man's truth. You'll have to move fast, Silas warned. Crow and his men are coming today. He knows we have the ledger. Toma chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. They always come, boy. The trick is to be gone before they arrive. But Silas shook his head. I'm not running. Not this time. Toma stared at him, his expression turning serious. You cannot hold this place alone. It's time someone did, Silas said, his voice quiet but unshakable. Ivy stepped forward, her decision made in an instant. Then I'm staying with him. No, Silas said immediately. This is not your fight anymore. Ivy met his gaze without flinching. My father's bones are in that canyon. His honor is in that ledger. We found the truth together. If I run now, I'm just as guilty as the men who buried it. Toma looked between the two of them, a slow smile spreading across his face. Stubbornness runs thicker than blood in this place, he sighed. Very well. Then we work fast. He turned to the young woman. Kimmy, bring the tools. To Ivy and Silas's astonishment, Kimmy opened her saddlebag and pulled out thin tracing paper, jars of carbon ink, and a small, portable printing press. We have been doing this for years, Toma explained, copying their land deeds, their mining claims, their false treaties. Every time they write a lie, we print a truth. For the next 2 hours, they worked with frantic, silent efficiency. Kimmy and Ivy traced every single page of the ledger, their fingers stained with ink. They made 2 complete copies, sealing them in waxed pouches. Just before noon, Toma and his writers prepared to leave. He took the original ledger. This will go to Prescott, he said. The copies stay with you. Let Crow find them. It will buy us time. He placed a hand on Silas's shoulder. You light that fire again, son, and more will come. Be ready. Then they were gone, melting back into the landscape as silently as they had arrived. The fort was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the calm before the storm. They didn't have to wait long. As the afternoon sun began to dip, a plume of dust rose on the southern horizon. It grew steadily larger, darker. Silas climbed to the top of the watchtower, a spyglass to his eye. 6 riders, he called down to Ivy, who was loading rifles in the blockhouse. Crow is with them. Are they armed? She shouted back. To the teeth, he replied. Ivy finished loading the last rifle, her movements sure and steady. There was no fear left in her, only a cold, hard resolve. She walked to the doorway and looked out at the approaching riders, now close enough to be seen with the naked eye. Then let's make sure this place remembers us, she said. They took their positions. Silas on the watchtower, with a rifle and a clear view of the entire area. Ivy behind the thick stone walls of the blockhouse, covering the main gate. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. But they were no longer just 2 people. They were the keepers of the truth. They were the memory of the land. And as Crow and his men rode into the shadow of the fort, the last watchfire, which had been smoldering all day, suddenly roared back to life, fed by a hidden stash of dry wood and oil. The flames leaped into the sky, a beacon of defiance, painting the ruins in a brilliant, bloody light. The battle for Fort Alden had begun. "Last chance, Tohi!" Crow's voice echoed across the dusty parade ground. He and his 5 hired guns sat on their horses just outside the crumbling main gate, their faces grim in the flickering firelight. "Give us the ledger and the girl, and you get to see another sunrise." Silas, perched in the watchtower, didn't answer. He laid his cheek against the cool wood of his rifle stock, his eye sighting down the long barrel. Below, Ivy stood in the doorway of the blockhouse, a rifle held loosely at her side, her face a mask of calm determination. "The ledger is gone, Crow," she shouted, her voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "And you're not getting me." Crow let out a short, humorless laugh. "Don't play dumb, sweetheart. We saw Toma's riders leave. We know you made copies. Hand them over and we'll make this quick. We're only being paid to get the papers, not to be gentle about it." One of the riders, a young man with nervous eyes, shifted in his saddle. These weren't soldiers. They were mercenaries, their only loyalty to the silver dollars in Crow's pocket. They were dangerous, but they weren't fanatics. Silas knew he had to break their nerve. "You ride with a man who murders his own," Silas's voice boomed from the tower. "He'll put a bullet in your back just as soon as he puts one in mine. Is Senator Thorne's money worth dying for?" Crow's face tightened with fury. "You think you're a hero, Apache? You think anyone gives a damn about a few dead Indians and a disgraced captain?" He raised his hand, the signal to attack. "There are no heroes here," he snarled. "Just the dead, and the people who kill them." He dropped his hand, and in that instant, a single gunshot cracked through the air. But it didn't come from the fort. It came from the ridges behind Crow. One of the mercenaries grunted, a red blossom appearing on his chest, and toppled from his saddle. Chaos erupted. Crow and his men wheeled their horses around, their eyes wide with shock. On the ridgeline, figures were rising from the rocks. 10, then 20, then more. Apache and Paiute warriors, armed with rifles and bows, materializing from the earth itself. And at their head, on a paint pony, sat Toma, a hunting bow raised high. He hadn't ridden to Prescott. He had circled back, bringing with him every warrior who had answered the smoke signal. Crow stared, his face a mask of disbelief. "No," he whispered. Silas's voice rang out again, a battle cry of righteous fury. "You thought we were alone, Crow. This land remembers its own." The battle was short and brutal. Crow's mercenaries, caught between the fort and the warriors on the ridge, broke in a panic. 2 of them spurred their horses and fled, chased by a volley of arrows. Another raised his rifle to fire at the tower, but a shot from Ivy's rifle sent him spinning to the ground. Gunfire and war cries filled the air. Dust and smoke choked the battlefield. Silas fired with deadly precision, picking off riders who tried to rally. Toma's warriors descended from the ridge like an avalanche, their attack swift and overwhelming. Within minutes, it was over. The surviving mercenaries had surrendered, their hands in the air. The dust began to settle, and in the center of the courtyard, only one man remained standing beside his horse, Elias Crow. His eyes burned with a venomous hatred. He slowly dismounted, drew his Colt, and took aim at Silas in the tower. "This was never your land," he growled, a man defeated but not broken. "You think a few words in a book can change that?" Silas descended from the tower, his own rifle lowered. He walked out to meet Crow in the open ground. "You didn't build anything here, Crow. You just stole it, and you buried the truth under the bodies of my people." "The dead don't speak," Crow sneered, raising his pistol. But he never got the chance to fire. A single shot rang out from the blockhouse. Ivy. Her aim was true. The bullet tore through Crow's shoulder, sending his pistol flying into the dust. He staggered back, clutching his arm, and fell to his knees, his face twisted in pain and disbelief. Silas walked over to him, crouching down to look the defeated man in the eye. "You'll live," he said quietly, "long enough to stand trial." Crow laughed, a bloody, bitter sound. "Trial? There isn't a court in this territory that would convict me." Toma stepped forward, his warriors surrounding them. "Then they will have to learn," the old man said. They bound Crow's hands and tended to the wounded. As the sun finally set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the fort, Ivy stood on the porch, her rifle finally lowered. Her hands were trembling, but her heart was steady. It was over. The last watchfire burned low. Its job done. 3 weeks later, the courthouse in Prescott was a media circus. Elias Crow, his arm in a sling, stood before a federal judge, his face an unreadable mask as the charges were read. Murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. The original ledger, presented by a delegation of tribal elders led by Toma, was entered into evidence. Senator Marcus Thorne was indicted the next day. The scandal rocked the territory, a political earthquake that exposed the rotten foundations upon which the new state was being built. Back at Fort Alden, the wind blew gently through the newly repaired walls. Silas was on the roof of the blockhouse, hammering a new beam into place. The fort was no longer a ruin. It was being reborn. Ivy walked up the path from the spring, a satchel full of newspapers and letters over her shoulder. The story was everywhere. The truth was out. She stopped at the bottom of the ladder, looking up at him. "You ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. Silas stopped hammering and looked out over the land. His land. "I did once," he said, "for a long time. But I was wrong. This land doesn't just remember. It holds you. It calls you home." He smiled down at her. "And now, so do I." She smiled back, a real, brilliant smile that reached her eyes. "Then I guess we have some new stories to write." As the first stars of evening appeared in the twilight sky, they lit the fire in the hearth. Not a signal fire, not a watch fire. Just a fire, a beacon of warmth and light in the heart of a place that had been dark for far too long. A promise that what was buried would always, eventually, come to light. Thank you for staying with me through that entire story. If you believe that truth can never be buried forever, and that justice, no matter how long it takes, is always worth fighting for, do me a solid favor. Hit that like button, and, more importantly, subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows me to keep these stories, these memories, alive. And you never know what secrets we might uncover next.